Because I saw
Morning, students, parents, and teachers. Thank you so much for hanging in there with us as we started late. I would have loved to have you. Oh, hold on, there's a sorry guys, there's a feedback. I don't know if you guys heard that. Sorry about that. Hopefully I fixed that feedback situation. But yeah, we were waiting for more students of your fellow students to join us. But we need to just start because our wonderful, amazing presenter is all the way in Cairo. And there is a major time difference. So we would like for her to be able to do the presentation and then hopefully go and have her dinner and relax after a long day. So we're just gonna jump right in. And Heba, you can hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. Okay, and thank you.
Okay, great. So everyone, I'm just gonna make her introduce herself quickly, and then we're just gonna jump right into the presentation. So Heba, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And again, we are so sorry for keeping you here. But students will just join, as we do the presentation. We can't wait any longer. So let's just start. So if you can introduce yourself to our students.
Yes. First of all, thank you, Alexis, for the very kind invitation. I was super excited when I got your email inviting me to join you back in Jamaica, even if it's just virtually. I have to say I've been to Jamaica for a workshop in 2019, in December 2019, and that was when I've met the absolutely wonderful Alexis, who's just, she made me feel like I'm in Egypt. And I have to say, Jamaica has a lot of similar traits with Egypt. I do prefer Jamaican music for Egyptian music, to be to be honest, because it's much more vibrant and it's very funny. But I was extremely lucky to be in Jamaica in 2019 and enjoy meeting Alexis and all the other colleagues and knowing more about Jamaican heritage and history. And we do have a lot in common in terms of our the colonial histories that we also happen to share. We also, or not to share, we also had to suffer from here in Egypt as well. And introducing myself, I am an Egyptologist, and I do research in the history of Egyptian archaeology. But more recently, I've been working on the history of Egyptian archaeology in terms of the colonial practices that had to do and how did the Egyptian heritage end up being so disturbed, so dispersed throughout the whole world. And there is a piece of Egypt nearly in every single country in the world. This includes Jamaica, which I've seen a bit of the collection when I was at the National Museum, and even I think it was the Museum of Music as well, where they had a bit of Egyptian stuff there. And I'm more interested in this history of dispersion. How and why did Egyptian heritage get to be dispersed throughout the world? That's my current focus. But for my PhD research, which I got from the UK, it was more focused on the history of the Greeks, when the Greeks were ruling Egypt. And when I got Alexis' email, I wasn't really sure what I should present. And we had a bit of discussion, and she would even be surprised to the sudden turn of events that I'm presenting something that has nothing to do with what we agreed on. Sorry, it's still Egypt. It's still the same focus. But I felt that because I wanted people and the students and all of us to reflect on how so much of the past could be used by us to reflect on our present in terms of how our knowledge of the past can help us in doing a bit of analysis of of the present conditions that we live in, and how we can, for once, learn from the lessons of history, because we never do. And I felt that maybe today I can show you an example of how we can a little bit use, in the case of Egypt, the heritage and the history to perhaps unpack some of the political realities that we could be facing today, specifically political communication, political propaganda. How are we meant to interpret the messages that tend to be sent to us by governments, be it local governments or foreign governments, and the examples from Egyptian history that could teach us how to fine-tune the way we see our states in a way that helps us understand better how governments and states operate, but lessons from the past. And I think that the recent events in the United States, when it was like the Trump affair and his rule, which I felt it's a global incident that we can all more or less relate to, or we know a bit about. And I felt that I can use this as the starting point of how we can use Egyptian history, or the history of how the Greek kings ruled Egypt, and used what we can call today soft power in trying to rule a multicultural society with a lot of history. And I felt this can be something that is relevant to both Egyptian political realities today and Jamaican political realities today as well. Something for us to know, that history is not just to know the events and the facts, but it's something that can help us even at the present to understand more and more, and perhaps think of a better future for ourselves and the world. So if I can just get, if Alexis can allow me to share my screen, I will be grateful. So if I can get, to share my screen.
Heba, do you see the option?
When I press on share screen, I get the host disabled attendees screen sharing. So if you are the host and you can just give me access.
Try it now. Let me see.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay.
Also, by the way, like to all the attendees, I love the way it's very friendly communication in Jamaica, and people are very open, etc. It's very similar to the way we do things here in Egypt. So if any of you have any questions or want to interrupt me at the time, don't think of this as a formal, very stiff type of lecture. It's more of a friendly discussion. I'm here to equally learn from you. You're not just, so it's a more of a two-way dialogue. So if anyone has any questions along the way, if you do, honestly, don't be shy to interrupt me or to ask me any questions. I'm just here to learn as well, and for us to exchange expertise and perhaps ideas. So do feel free to just ask me.
And as well, all our students who are on the YouTube, if you have any questions, you can type them in the YouTube chat feature, and we will read out the questions to our presenter. Heba, see if you can share now. See if
Yes, now I can share. Yeah.
All right, great.
Okay. Can you all see my screen now? If you can tell me.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So usually when we talk about ancient Egypt, we talk about the very early civilization, and that's the very focus of everyone. But rarely do people focus at the later years of ancient Egyptian civilization, when Egypt became more of a very multicultural society after the death of Alexander the Great. We all know of Alexander the Great, I'm sure, and how that he made a huge or a very large empire, which we ended up now calling Alexander the Great's empire, or the Hellenistic Empire. And after his death, each of his army generals took a part of the empire for him, or I wouldn't say herself, for himself, and he took it as their own property, in the sense of it became theirs. And Egypt became, apologies if you can hear the squeezes of the chair, but I can do nothing about that. But Egypt ended up being the share of Ptolemy I, one of the army generals of Alexander the Great. And when Ptolemy I ruled Egypt, he started a dynasty, a family rule, very similar to the Egyptian traditions. And which is what we call today in Egyptian heritage, or in Egyptian archaeology or history, the Ptolemaic Dynasty. and this would be around 300 BC. It's it lasted from 323 BC up till 30 BC, up till the Romans invaded Egypt, or up till Egypt became part of the Roman Empire. Why I chose the Ptolemaic period, apart from it being the era that I do specialize in, is because I think most of you would know the Rosetta Stone, right? Everyone knows the Rosetta Stone. I would assume it's usually known as the most famous stone in the world, and it did give us the key to ancient Egyptian heritage and civilization. But rarely do we know that if it weren't for this multicultural society, or if it weren't for the Ptolemaic dynasty, or of this very successful combination between the Greeks and the Egyptians working together in creating a powerful state, we would have never been offered the Rosetta Stone, without which we wouldn't have been able to crack the code of ancient Egypt, or be able to read the hieroglyphic inscriptions that are covering all the temples and tombs and the artifacts, which allowed us to know more and more about the inside of the Egyptian heritage. Today, knowing or talking about multiculturalism, or having a diverse society, it's becoming something integral in the world, specifically in the Western world, more or less. In Europe and in North America, with the high rates of immigration, multiculturalism became like a question that we all have, more than a necessity. It's a question because it could be used by some governments as a positive impact, but others tend to use it as a negative impact, as is the case today with the rise in the right wing, or in the rise of having extreme views in terms of politics, social, cultural ideas, or even religious ideas. Although multiculturalism is meant to be an aspect of tolerance, where you would have a society that is so distinctive in terms of being so diverse, but it lies within the government. It's the governments that define whether such multiculturalism would work or not. And the key here is tolerance, in the sense of understanding that the more diverse that the state or that the country becomes, the more local, not global, that the laws or the way you govern has to be. And I'll explain how, and the way that this was done in Egypt. I'll take the example from the UK, because this happened when I was living back in the UK. And one of the reasons why me as a person, as an Egyptian, was very interested in researching or knowing more about the Ptolemaic period, or about the Greco-Roman, when the Greeks and Romans ruled Egypt, because Egypt itself was a very diverse country until 1956, when all the foreigners were forced to leave the country for weird political reasons. And I was always longing to living somewhere where there is this diversity of cultures, this diversity of religions. And I was lucky to be able to get a scholarship to do my PhD in the UK. And the UK is extremely diverse, and it has generations of immigration. Obviously, this is not for the right reasons, because it's extremely diverse due to it being a huge an unjust colonial power. So, but anyway, this is the reality of the UK today in terms of immigration, etc. But a few years ago, in 2016, they had what they call the Brexit, or how that Britain wants to exit the EU. It doesn't want to become part of the collective EU. And what was interesting is that the areas within the UK where there was the highest rates of immigration, these were the areas, or the most diverse of cities within Egypt, within the UK, were the ones who were very keen on remaining part of a bigger, or of a more diverse global power. And this is the question that I had. It's just, I use this comic always to reflect on how that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, yet those who do study history are doomed to stand by helplessly while everyone else repeats it. And this is how I always felt, because of me knowing how ancient multicultural societies operated, particularly in the case of Egypt. I always knew that there are solutions that history or the past can offer us to solve the very recent or the very modern problems that we face today. But sadly, no one seems to be interested in learning from history, or no one seems to be open to learning from history. And I thought that maybe today can be my opportunity, or our opportunity, to reflect together on how we can learn from the past in a positive way. What I want to discuss today is when the Greeks were ruling Egypt, and how the Egyptians as well, not just the Greeks, managed to understand the diversity, or having a multicultural society, far better than us today. And this is the contribution that this early civilization, that is Egypt, perhaps have to the world, that is not just in terms of, because I feel that everyone tends to focus when it comes to ancient Egypt about the pyramids or the temples, or the contribution in art, the contribution in technology of making things, making artifacts, but rarely do we reflect on their contribution to human civilization in the sense of coexistence, or how societies can live together, or how to be more or less open to the various social strata and the various cultures living within one country, or sharing a land. And I felt that maybe today we can discuss this together. This is the extent of the Hellenistic world, and we can see the Yellow Kingdom is the kingdom of the Ptolemies, that is Egypt. And Egypt reached its furthest extent, or it was like one of, it managed to take over a lot of possessions from outside Egypt. During the time of the Ptolemies, Egypt reached, it was, one can call it an empire, particularly during the Ptolemies, as they were able to add extra land, be it from Africa, or be it from the Mediterranean, or even from some of the islands that existed, some of the Greek islands that existed in the Mediterranean, to add them up to their own possession, and they become part of the wider, or the bigger Ptolemaic kingdom that is Egypt at the time. So this is also, again, another lesson that we can learn. What was interesting is that, despite of how I think, and I will try to prove to you today, that they were extremely successful, the Ptolemies, the Romans had another ideas. When after the Romans entered Egypt, particularly during Emperor Augustus, when he entered Egypt and he was having a tour in Alexandria, and the priest who was offering him the tour then asked him if he would be interested in visiting the tombs of the Ptolemaic kings, and he said, "No, I came to see a king, not a row of corpses." And it gives you an indication of how the Romans looked very down upon the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Ptolemaic dynasty, although the Ptolemies were far more successful in having a strong empire, which has lasted far longer than the Roman Empire as well. So it's all about perspective and the way we tend to see things. If we look at the Ptolemaic dynasty, and even from the timeline that I have here, when looking, does it give you the impression of something that is purely Greek or purely Egyptian? For me, it's a mix. We would see a Ptolemaic king here looking exactly like a pharaoh. The Ptolemies has a mix of a pharaoh and a Greek ruler. Then you become more Greek by time, but you'd have very small signs of Egyptian heritage. But when it comes to Cleopatra II, it's openly Egyptian. Ptolemy VIII, it's openly Egyptian, etc., etc. So it was a very mixed dynasty that one can't call it either purely Greek or purely Egyptian. It was a mixture of cultures, and because of staying honest to this mixture, they were able to rule Egypt peacefully, and they were able to more or less stay for longer and be extremely successful. This is the longest ruling dynasty in the history of Egypt itself. They ruled the length of the Ptolemaic dynasty is the longest. And when studying history, although we shouldn't do that, but sometimes we use the length of rule as an indication of the success of a certain king or of a certain line of rulers. And if this would be the case, if this would be the variable that we use to assess the success or the failure of the Ptolemaic dynasty, then the Ptolemies have been extremely successful in this regard, because they were the longest. It's the longest ruling dynasty in the history of Egypt, in the whole history of Egypt, not only during pharaonic times or ancient Egyptian times, but throughout the whole of Egyptian history up till today. Then again, here we would see the the nomes, or perhaps the various cities or the various capitals. And what we would see here is that the amount of cities that were introduced to Egypt or to the empire by the Greeks, and from there, and you can see that they weren't only focusing on the Mediterranean, they weren't only focusing on the north or the links that they can have with Greece, but they were equally interested in Asia, as we would see here. They were equally interested in Africa, as we would see below here as well. But most importantly, they were equally interested in the core of Egypt. They made a lot of additions, or they've erected a lot of new cities in the rule within Egypt itself. So they weren't just foreign or external rulers of Egypt who had no interest in the country itself, but they've made so much investment in the country itself. Yet today, there are so many modern biases when it comes to the way that we look at Egyptian history. And I have to say that these biases come from our own modern biases against multiculturalism or against diversity of cultures or diversity of religion. They are not biases that existed within Egypt at the time of the Ptolemies themselves. For example, there is this tendency in making a very clear distinction between what is Greek and what is Egyptian, what is the East and what is the West. A distinction, or a stark distinction, that didn't exist at the time. And I'll show you how it didn't exist at the very time when the Ptolemies were ruling Egypt. This distinction that the historians or the Egyptologists who are very keen to make, it leads to a lot of misinterpretation of the past, and it leads to losing so much of the interesting information. And perhaps this is the skill that I would like to exchange here, that maybe we can use ancient Egypt as an example of how being more open and operating, when learning about the past, operating beyond typologies or operating beyond very strict timelines or very strict interpretation, this can give us a wider view of how the world existed back then, because most of the biases that we have today didn't exist in ancient times. This is the stark evidence that I'm talking about. I don't know if how is the case in Jamaican museums, but I think when I've been to Jamaica, the display in Jamaican museums remains very true or very honest to the local culture. And what I loved the most is how in Jamaica, you don't tend to adopt Western methods of displaying artifacts or Western methods of operating within museums. I remember all the extremely lovely videos and the reconstruction that you had about the earlier Jamaican history or the history of your ancestors. And this is totally anti-Western, and this is totally the way that museums should be displaying other cultures. And I think that we have this problem when displaying Egypt, that we tend to make very clear distinction of what is Egyptian and what could be another culture that existed within Egypt. And here we have the example of Greece. So, for example, if you go to the British Museum in London, where the Rosetta Stone is on display today, you would see the ancient Egypt department. This is a department that stands by itself. But you would find objects that are Egyptian, that were exported from Egypt, but artifacts that doesn't look 100% Egyptian in the Western modern view of Egypt, or in the Western imagined view of how Egypt should look like. These artifacts, for example, the ones in the bottom row, all these three exist today in the British Museum in London, but you would not see them you would not see them in the ancient Egyptian galleries, but you would see them in the Greek and Roman gallery, although these three artifacts, they come from Egyptian land and they were retrieved from Egyptian cities, and they were possibly made, or like the artist who carved them was equally Egyptian, or even if he was Greek, he might have considered himself as Egyptian, being someone who has been fed and bred in the country. So these biases lead us to having such narrow view, not just of us in terms of, and not just of the past, not just of the past, but equally of ourselves and of the others. And it leads to a lot of, as I said, extreme view about other cultures and other traditions and other religions, which is damaging in modern times, but it seems that in the past the solution was there. And again, this is the division of how the ancient Egyptian material is divided and displayed within the Egyptian, within the British Museum in London. As you would see that we would have the Egyptian gallery. This is the Egyptian gallery, the purple and the yellow. But in all of the other numbers, in the rest of the galleries, there will be objects that are retrieved from Egypt, but they would not be placed in the yellow section or in the purple section because they are not perceived by the Western methodology of displaying objects or the Western methodology of interpreting artifacts as Egyptian, because they have traces or they have traits of a cultural mix or of a fusion between cultures. We all know, obviously, Cleopatra, and Cleopatra is usually the star when anyone talks about Egypt. But again, this is why the Ptolemaic dynasty, I think, is very important, because it tends to be very famous in the public imagination today. We all know of Cleopatra. We all know about the romantic or the romance that the affair that she has with Antony, the Roman emperor, and how this romantic affair led to the fall of Egypt into Roman hands. But we never talk about the positives of the dynasty or the internal affairs of the dynasties that could be of interest to us today, I think, that are extremely interesting for us today. As I said, or as I was, yes?
Can I just want to make a comment that it's very interesting that you mentioned about how here in Jamaica, we do exhibitions.
Yes.
Because actually, I have gotten comments from people saying the opposite. Instead of it being positive, why is it that Jamaica does not conform to Western standards?
But that's why you're doing it right, because these Western standards leads to the misinterpretation that I'm talking about today. And these Western standards led to, for example, and as an Egyptologist, these Western standards led to the isolation of modern Egyptians like myself from our ancestors and from our ancient cultures. And this is why I was so moved in the Jamaican museums, and I kept on wishing that I wish that in Egypt we display our heritage or our ancestors the way you do, because the only way to succeed in this world is being local. Adopting Western methods, it means that you adopt a Western imagined concept of how the world should be. And I have to say, the Western methods are extremely colonial, and they are full of so much biases and racism in the way of how they perceive the other, the way of how they perceive other races or cultures, right, Alexis? So is this the complaint that you have? Is this why in Jamaica you don't conform to Western methodologies of display and interpretation?
Yes, because as you said, we want to display it in a cultural context. And as I said, I'm just so happy that you made that comment, and I will be telling our curators and that what you've said, because everything that you're saying now makes so much sense. I don't know how our students feel about it. I don't know if any of you guys want to make your own comments or observations. Those who have been to National Museum Jamaica and other maybe museums around the world, how you feel about it. But definitely, I am in full agreement with Heba and I'm just happy that we have accomplished that in our exhibitions. So if any students have any comments, just let us know.
Yes, please let us know. Yes, obviously. Yes, interfere. Do come forward and say, because I love the displays in Jamaica. I'm not saying this just because I'm invited for a lecture in Jamaica. And like, no one asked me to say this, and it wasn't even part of. This is a totally different topic than what I agreed with Alexis. But I felt that this is why I because I was extremely moved of the way you do the displays there, and I felt that Jamaican museums do have the solution for cultures like Egyptian culture, because it was colonized as well as in similar to the very case of Jamaica, etc. But you've managed so successfully to move yourselves away from this colonial lens. And I felt that there are so many lessons that we can learn from the way you display things. And I think that it also brings us to the global issues of how usually Western standards are perceived as the best standards. And I don't think that this should be the case, because obviously there are cultural differences, there are social differences, and what works for them shouldn't necessarily work for the rest of the world. And this is, again, a very racist, biased view of the world that is very similar to colonialism. And it's usually how I always believe that, yeah, maybe we don't have proper colonial troops on the ground, but we are still colonized by the way they imagine us. They tend to appropriate our cultures in a way that is so wrong, that remains colonizing, maybe not actively colonizing, but even colonizing the way that other people perceive us. And I have to say, the example here in the British Museum is extremely telling, because all of these artifacts in front of you, they are Ptolemaic, they go back, but because of how in Western interpretation they are perceived as Egyptian style of art, they were all placed in the sculpture room of the British Museum. Yet when you move a bit further, and that's a gallery that is parallel to the ancient Egyptian gallery, you would see these artifacts, and all of these artifacts here, they are from Egypt. They are not just from Alexandria, but some of them come from the south of Egypt, which is extremely Egyptian, but they are not displayed with the ancient Egyptian material. They are displayed with the Greek and Roman room. So they are not defined as being Egyptian artifacts. Even in the museum database, in the museum catalog, when you research them, they are not perceived as Egyptian material, although they are, because they only show the progression of culture and the fusion and what happens when different cultures move. And I think that this gives us how that the biases that we got from colonialism are still there, because of the concept of very clean races, and the concept of how cultures are not meant to evolve, are not meant to change, is very Western, and it's very colonial. And it's very apparent in the case of ancient Egypt. Only what counts as extremely Egyptian, as in what they perceive as Egyptian, which is this type of artistic features, this is Egypt. But something like this, that is a fusion of Egyptian and Greek traditions, this is not Egypt anymore. So again, this is a very colonial, racist view of things, and it's very problematic. And something simple as a museum display like this does have profound impact on the way people see things, see themselves, and see the world, and see the other. So again, I would like to congratulate like the National Museum of Jamaica and all the museum curators in Jamaica of how profoundly local and extremely innovative and moving away from Western methods of interpretation and display that made it, for me, a case study that I would love to be given the opportunity one day to implement in Egypt or in any Western museum that has ancient Egyptian artifacts. The perspective, as I'm saying, is starting to move a little bit in research projects. This is a research project that is done by the British Museum, again, to try to move away from this Egyptians versus Greeks, Egyptian heritage versus Greek heritage, etc. But it remains a research project. We haven't seen any change on the display. We haven't seen any change on the actual real modern public imagination. So it's just on paper. It doesn't come with any changes in the display itself. Very recently, 3 years or 4, in 2016, there has been a huge blockbuster exhibition in the British Museum on the Ptolemaic Dynasty, which they called Sunken Cities. And it talks about the Egyptian artifacts that got sunk. In Alexandria, there has been a series of, or Egypt has suffered from a series of volcanoes and from like massive earthquakes that led to Alexandria, or parts of it, totally collapsed, and it got swamped under the sea. And there are areas within Alexandria, within the Mediterranean in the part of the Mediterranean Sea that overlooks Egypt, which we mark archaeologically, that do have ancient Egyptian remains or Egyptian artifacts sunk in the ground, some sunk under like under the sea. Some of them we've managed to retrieve, but others remain under the sea, waiting to be rescued one day, hopefully, if they can. What is again talking about what Alexis was saying, and the way that why we shouldn't conform to Western methodologies of interpretation or display. Here we have, this is the movie Alexander, and this is the final scene from the movie Alexander. What you would see here, which is extremely problematic, is that everyone who comes with a darker skin, and obviously who comes low in the social strata, is perceived as Egyptian. But all the white, rich and famous people in this scene are those who come very high in, are those who in the movie, this is not what happened in reality, in the movie, perceived as the higher up elite or the king. So this is Ptolemy the First here, and all those who are white, these are like the nobles and the members of the court, but those of a darker skin are the Egyptians. And this is extremely untrue. And this is again a very problematic way of how even portrayals of the past, not just in museums, but equally in the movies or cinemas, it does have an impact on how certain cultures are perceived, or how how the way we perceive ancient societies or the way we interpret ancient societies is done. Because even during when the Greeks were ruling Egypt, it wasn't as it wasn't very it had nothing to do with the colonialism that we have in modern times, when there is a foreign ruler coming and they become the elite and they exploit everyone and everything, while the locals become extremely lowly and they hold no power whatsoever. This wasn't the case in ancient Egypt. And it is again how we tend to hold very much to these Western modern biases that leads again to misinterpretation, but equally to perceptions of how darker skins don't matter as much as whiter skin. And this is a problem that I personally have faced in the years that I was living in the UK. All the acts of racism that I suffered from, either due to the color of my skin or to my religion, to my religious beliefs, or just being a woman. And this would happen just outside the galleries of the British Museum, where people would be extremely marveling and extremely in awe of Egyptian artifacts. But me as an Egyptian, just because I don't conform to this perception of what counts as Egyptian, they have no problem with being biased against me or being racist or intolerant towards me, although I'm not just an Egyptian, but equally a specialist in the Egyptian history. But yeah, that's for another lecture. So now you would move. Yes.
I just want to tell you that to share with everyone that growing up, I thought Egyptians were white.
Yeah, they
because
weren't.
of what I saw in movies.
Yeah, exactly.
Cleopatra with Liz Taylor. Just as an example, it's and then not even thinking, okay, Egypt is in Africa. There are many different shades of black. Oh, they're just like in Jamaica.
Exactly.
It was just mind-opening when I got older and started to read more and read outside of textbooks, that I was like, wow, this is what Egyptians look like. This is the real Egypt.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things we like to encourage our students to look outside of these colonial narratives.
Exactly.
Even in Jamaica, just like what you just shared, we have certain biases as well, where even myself, being the color that I am, people think I should not speak on certain issues because I'm not Black enough.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. It's a problem.
Always, because I'm female as well, there's that little hint, but people feel I should not speak on certain issues because I'm not Black enough, even though I am Black. So I just wanted to share that. with
No,
our-
thank you. This is so heartwarming. And who has the right to share what is Black enough and what is not Black? Like, no one has the right to tell anyone how they should feel about themselves, because I perceive myself as African. But this is again an issue that I would, within an African context, people wouldn't see me, other Africans wouldn't see me as African. But I always perceive myself as many things, and one of them is being African. And yeah, it's a problem. No one should have the right to define how I feel about myself and what I should and shouldn't talk about. And yeah, it's so problematic. And I'm extremely happy that you're encouraging your students to think outside of those, because this is all part of the colonial legacy. This is it's true. They hate it when they like the West hates it when we say this, but it's true. This never existed before colonialism. This never existed before. And colonialism, I'm talking about not just like the modern colonialism that we're talking about, but even the Roman colonialism when they were establishing the Roman Empire. Such concepts of racism come from there. And even something that is very simple as the perception that we have of how all Romans were white, it's not true. It's just because of how the statues today look white, because they lost the color given the state of preservation. But we know for sure that many of what we see as very white Roman statuary, one day it was extremely colored, and one day it was very vibrant, and there were many Romans who weren't white. But again, and this comes from these roots which we should always point at and look in the eye. And I'm extremely happy that the students are already because I didn't have this opportunity when I was young, just like you, Alexis, thinking this outside the box. I was taught from a very narrow perspective as well, because we equally have, we've adopted the same colonial narrative about ourselves. And yeah, so I did struggle too. And it's only when I got older and when I moved away from the traditional textbooks that we were taught at school that I came to realize that yeah, what we were always fed was never true. So, shall I go on? Or does anyone have any other questions? Yeah.
Any students want to make any comments? Anybody wants to share, or should we move on? Okay, but I guess maybe they'll chime in later.
Okay, perfect. So the very lesson that, and I'm sure you all know James Bond, like it's famous. It's just a global icon all over the world, and equally Queen Elizabeth. And I think that what she does very well, and it's something that the Ptolemies or the Greeks and the Egyptians, when they were ruling Egypt, is how this conception of soft power, where you are a king or a ruler, but you also have these soft traits where you are able to mingle, or you would do acts that doesn't make you being very arrogant or being on top. However, I have to say, the scene that we see here, it has nothing to do. It doesn't mean that the queen is not arrogant, or that she's like that she's open to all types of social strata, etc. But it's the image that she wants to convey. What the intentions behind the image could be a lot of things, and we shouldn't take it for granted that it's a sincere image. We need to unpack it and carefully deconstruct it bit by bit. But it's just the concept of how being so soft, moving away, like being one of them, showing that you are one of the people. You are cool enough to walk beside James Bond and like have your dogs beside you. And that came during the opening of the Olympics in 2012. And I think that all the messages that the UK was sending in this ceremony, and I don't know how old the students were by that time, but you can always Google it and watch the opening in YouTube. All the messages that they were sending of how they are extremely multicultural, they are open despite the very, very long history of colonialism that they have and the exploitation that they have. They did it so subtle that you could believe it, that you could truly believe that this was the case. And this totally goes against their vote of Brexit, of moving away from the EU, or moving, or not wanting to be part of a multicultural society, or how they are tightening immigration today, and they are not very keen on having foreign presence today. And So you would always tailor the message on the occasion. So when it was the Olympics, because it was a global event and we're inviting the whole world, so we do it very softly, we do it very subtle, we do it in a way that we are welcoming to everyone. The same happens in like in Egypt, because in Egypt, even in modern Egypt today, this is the way you can influence others. And this is something that I want to tell you of how in the past they understood that these means of influencing others, or these means of influencing public opinion, they are unsuccessful. And the Ptolemies had an extremely successful way, or the ancient Egyptians had an extremely counter way of influencing others, not by beating them up, or not by offering them the carrot, not by just giving them the carrot first and like diverting their attention from all the biases that you would have, or the exploitation that you would offer. Or it's the only way that you can rule others, be it diverse others or be it extremely local, is by being attractive, showing yourself as someone who's an attractive ruler. And attraction has many ways. Today, if we look at attraction, we have all the manga and the Korean type of anime, and we have obviously Gangnam Style, the song that made the whole world look at Korea in a totally different light, or James Bond, again, as part of the soft power that the UK uses, or the Olympics as an event, or as an event that the countries who tend to host use it as a means of attracting other cultures or attracting other nations to them. This is not new whatsoever. It's something that even during the time of Alexander the Great, or during the time of the Ptolemies, they've done this so right. Do you all see how today in our coins or in our banknotes, we would have the images of the rulers of the country? I know this is not the case of Jamaica, and I know this from Alexis herself. You remember Alexis, if you want to interfere. I love how we have this as a dialogue. When you interfered in the workshop, and when you stood up and you made a commentary about, can you tell this to the students about one of the images of the banknote? Because I think this is a very interesting example for them to see the difference. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, if I remember correctly, my poor brain, when you we were talking about, yes, figures on like money, and
Yes.
I mentioned that we have Nanny of the Maroons. Is
Yeah.
that what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly
right.
what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yes.
On our
Yeah.
$500 bill. And I was just sharing with the audience what the bill looked like and the story behind why Nanny of the Maroons was such an important heroine to the Jamaican people, and why she, just a little bit of what she did to make her become a national hero. And she's the only national hero, female national hero we have. And probably one, if not the only, one of the very few female national heroes like in the world. So yeah, I remember, yeah, that's what I remember. Guys,
Yes,
this was
exactly.
2019, okay? Don't do things from yesterday. So just
I don't even remember things from yesterday, but I remember that because it was like it struck me, because again, one thing that I think in Jamaica you do very right is how you use national icons in your, because I've seen in your coins when I was there and in your banknotes, you tend to use national icons, something that the society can relate to, not just the rulers, but something that the whole world can relate to. And what I wanted to say here is that it was Egypt, or it was the Ptolemaic Dynasty, when the Greeks were ruling Egypt, that they introduced this concept of having the figure of the ruler on coins or in banknotes. This was the first time that it was introduced to the world. It came out of Egypt. This conception of having a ruler minted, or the image of the ruler struck on a coin. And here we have the image of Alexander the Great, although he was dead by the time. But the Ptolemies, or the Ptolemy the First, and this is a coin that was minted in Alexandria. And when you see it instantly, you wouldn't perceive this as Egyptian whatsoever. But there are a few extremely like signs that only if you are an Egyptologist, or only if you know how to deconstruct ancient Egyptian signs, you would see here the corns of the ram, and this is an indication or identification of the major god of the Egyptian pantheon, god Ammon, and he was usually ram-headed. And when you have the horns of the ram, this means that you are like a god king, or that you identify yourself with the major god Amun or god Ammon. And so again, there are these very small symbols, and you would have the elephant cap that Alexander the Great was very famous with, because of how he would they've introduced elephants in the army, etc. And having an elephant cap would be that this is an elephant that they took or they killed during the war of the opponent, and then Alexander the Great would wear it as a sign of his power over the enemies, etc. But so this is in itself is a mix between Egyptian and Greek traditions. But beyond this multiculturalism, the concept behind having a ruler struck on a coin, or having this minted in a coin, it means that there was this conception or this interest that they wanted the ruler to be seen, and this is the way of being attractive or making connections with the society, or making connection with the people. So for the first time, the ruler is not this extremely far off image that no one can imagine, no one can think about. No, but he's very close to you, that you can see him, you can touch him on the coin, not obviously physically, but it is this symbolism, these soft messages that I think when we learn from ancient times, they would help us, as I was saying in the very beginning, to deconstruct many of the political messages that we tend to receive every day, be it in our countries or in a global setting. And this was the conception that the king is there, is attractive, he's someone, but he's not that far off ruler that you cannot have any access to, but he's in everyone's hand. He's someone who cares about his people, and they can see him, they can touch him, even in coinage. So you build this bond, or this soft symbolic bond with your people by a very simple act of having yourself struck or minted on a coin. And the conception of having a royal portrait depicted on something, this is again something that we got from ancient Egypt. This is one of the earliest civilizations who introduced portraying the kings or portraying the rulers in a way that could be accessible to the people, even if it's from a very far distance. But for people to be attracted to you, to respect you, but equally to fear you, you have to be seen, you have to be available. Or this comes in contrast or contradictory to the concept in Japan, in another earlier civilization in Japan or in China, where you get all the power by being extremely invisible. So the emperor is usually very invisible. His palace would be extremely far off, that it would be kilometers and kilometers. You would never see the end or the beginning of the royal palace in China, in earlier China or in Japan. The concept was different. So in the Far East, as how they would like to call it, it was all about invisibility. But in the Near or Middle East, as in the earlier civilization of the Near and Middle East, it is these civilizations who introduced to the world the importance of the ruler or of the royal power to be seen, to be visible, for both, for attraction and fear. Like that you would fear him because of how powerful he would look like. So you would fear him because here he's already smiting enemies. He looks like he's a soldier. He's an emperor who have a lot of military might. So you would see him, you would touch him, but you would equally fear him and be obliged to listen to whatever rules he would put on you. Again, this type of mix that we see. So what we have here is a very interesting example of the Ptolemaic rulers and how the Egyptian artists or the Egyptian sculpture at the time was sending all of those hidden messages. I don't know if you can see it, but when looking at this portrait, do you feel that he's extremely stiff, he is grumpy, or does he look as someone optimistic, open? what do you think? Would anyone tell us? Like when you look at this image here, how do you feel about this person? Is he someone that you would fear? Is he someone who looks grumpy? Or is he someone that is more close to you, or you can have some sort of connection with?
Well, a student has said that the portrait looks optimistic and diplomatic. That's Biviana. I hope I'm pronouncing your name. Oh, and then Nikim says he looks Asian and a bit charismatic, maybe.
Exactly. Exactly. This type of the eye, I think you would say he looks Asian because of the eye. This slippery eye, it was something that introduced to Egypt during the Greek and Roman time, but it was something that already existed in Egypt before. As I said, because of how there was so much cultural interaction in Egypt even before Alexander the Great came to rule. But it is exactly this conception of being optimistic, diplomatic, charismatic. It is the message that they wanted to send out. We need to remember that when the Greeks came to rule Egypt, this was after another foreign rule, after the Persians. So to set themselves in comparison with the previous rulers who were like their not necessarily just the enemies, but they were their like the competition. They were the competitors for them. So they wanted to say that Persian rule was a time of fear, was a time of lack of optimism, because the Egyptians would have felt that Egypt is now under Persian rule and we will be stuck with non-Egyptian rulers forever. But this like smile, this like very narrow smile that you would see here, and this open diplomatic face, this charisma, it is a message that the Ptolemies were sending deliberately to the Egyptians, because these would be statues that would be placed in temples. And those who had access to the temples then were mainly the priests. And there were two main powers that one would fear in the Egyptian state at the time, either the army or the priesthood, because they were the two major powers who were capable or who were able to hold all the power over Egypt, or they can either make you win Egypt or lose it. It's a hit and miss, and the closer you are to the priests specifically, the more are your chances of being successful in your rule. So working together with the priests, they came with this image, with this portrait of having a smile, a hint of optimism, that is a message that is being sent to all the priests all over Egypt, that the Ptolemaic period is a time of optimism, is a time of diplomacy, is a time of charisma, in the sense that this is not a time of ruling by fear, but it's ruling by optimism and ruling by friendliness, unlike the Persians. And this is what I'm saying about the need, our need, specifically you as students, to learn from early on, because I only got to know these messages when I was, or to think of artifacts or to think of heritage this way when I started doing my PhD. But I think that now you all have the opportunity, being young enough to realize that the very interesting aspect about heritage or artifacts or objects in museums is the way that this is an artifact that you can read by deconstructing every single symbol that you can read. And by reading the bust or by reading the statue, you can very easily read the message that was intended to be sent out to the audiences. And what we need to reflect upon is that there was no monument that was made without a message, and that there was no monument that was made without reflection or thinking of an audience, of targeting an audience. And we need to understand that these conceptions of PR and what we know today about marketing, etc., this is not new at all. This is what people were doing. The way you would see yourself, or the way you target your Facebook profile message, or your Instagram, the photos that you share on Instagram or on Twitter or whatever, these are all messages that you yourself, that you are curating and sending to the world, because it's very intentional. I would want to send a message, for example, in a certain profile picture, if I'm wearing extremely chic and I look nice, and I wouldn't share a photograph if it has red spots and my eyes were shut, etc. You would always want to send a message of the best of you, either to gain admiration, or there is also the psychological aspect of sending a message or like sharing an image of the worst of you when you want to gain compassion or when you want to gain support. This was exactly the very same case with ancient times. This was exactly the very same case with the sculpturer at the time, that every single artifact, and this is not something that is peculiar for Egypt, all earlier civilizations and all earlier cultures had the very same PR machine and the marketing devices, but perhaps the medium or the media of communication that they were using was different, but they used what was available to them. Here you would see, yes,
Sorry,
sure.
we have a comment from one of our students, Nikim.
Yes, sure.
Says, priests were treated like the Pope, with more respect and revered than the king or the pharaoh, right? And as such, religion higher than royalty.
Of course.
I guess it's a comment / question.
Yes, it is. It is. And that's absolutely right, because the king was a god himself. And this meant that not only there was the importance of religion, that how religion was far important than royalty, but it means that the priests were far more important than the king, even though that they wouldn't dominate the scene or the stage. They wouldn't be the ones very upfront, but they would be the ones dominating the whole political power from behind the scenes. It is the priests who designed all of the messages that you would see in this very single statue. In this statue, we would see the head, what we call the nemes, or like the wig or the headdress that was very distinctive, that only the pharaoh would use. So this makes him distinctive from the rest of the social strata. It means that he's the one on the top of the social pyramid. Then we would have here the uraeus, or the cobra, which offers both protection to the king, but it also makes us perceive him as a deity or as a god. Then we would have the fake beard. Yes?
Sorry, Heba. I'm going to ask Nikim, can you unmute your mic and explain what you mean by the comment, discrete leaders? I don't know if Nikim can hear me.
So yes, miss.
Yeah, man. So ask your question, what, because I see you made a comment about discrete leaders.
All right, yes, miss. So discrete leaders, right? I was talking about like if they were like you know how people that like miss. Do you know like puppet masters and the puppeteers? Like how you would have these certain giant human beings just controlling the puppets on stage and stuff like that, miss. Would the priests and the Pope and those people be like that towards the leaders, like the pharaohs and the king, right?
Yes, you were extremely right, and I do love the discrete. This is the perfect terminology that one would use, because they were the real rulers, because the king couldn't have done anything without not just their advice, but without them preparing the roadmap for him. So this is why gaining the support of the temple, not just if you are a foreign ruler, but even if you are the local priest, was extremely crucial, because as I said, it was a make it or break it. If you have very strong relationship with the priests, because they were the ones engineering the whole system. And the temple was not only a religious power, it was equally an economic power, because the Egyptian temple, owned all the land surrounding it. And Egypt was an agricultural society. And by owning the land, it means that all of the Egyptians were working as farmers, were working for the temple. They were not working in reality for the royal court. Although that the king is the god and is the one who owns the land, and he would, of course, get a sum of what was paid to rent the land for farming, etc. But it was the priests who engineered this whole relationship, and it was them who made every single message that is being sent in this bust here. Something that is very simple as having the ears protruded like this, don't think that this is something that is haphazard, like this was just done for the sake of aesthetic, or this is because it looks artistically okay. But having the ears being protruded this way, it was a message that was being sent that the king can hear you, he can hear your demands, he's one of you, and he's there for you. And again, these are all these soft messages that it's something that we still do today. And in training ourselves of knowing these conceptions of how there are those discrete rulers behind the scenes, or there are those very discrete messages that one can see in an artifact, and by deconstructing the message, we are able to know whether we are being manipulated or who should we believe. And it can help us so much in making up our political decisions in terms of which party to follow or which person to vote for. The past or the heritage does offer us this training by deconstructing all the political messages in a statue like this, and perhaps doing the same with another with a portrait profile of a current ruler, like the present governor of Jamaica, or one of the governors of any part of Jamaica. It can help us to deconstruct and make our own minds about what are we meant to understand, who should we follow, are we being deceived, or or is this being an honest message? And this is what I meant by all the lessons that history can teach us. That is not only the lessons that we get from the events that have happened, but the lessons that we can get from a simple statue like this, and the training, the skills we can gain very easily from a museum. So this is why I want you next time, when you go and visit the wonderful National Museum of Jamaica, to go and try to deconstruct the many messages that are in the artifacts, and that is in a display. Because for me, the videos that I saw, retelling the story of the ancestors, I got the message very well, and I got the message of how Jamaican museum display wants to move away from the Western methods of interpretation. And I felt that this was a very successful message. So next time you go to the museum, do this training and train yourself, because it can help you in every aspect of life, not just in politics, but being able to make up your mind by yourself and deconstruct whatever image you are exposed to, be it in the media or be it in a social or a cultural political setting. You would have more agency and more power to make up your mind, rather than just being a follower who follows the crowd. It can make you more independent in the way you make up your mind. Or at least this was my experience. It was a turning point for me. The more that I learned about this, the more I was more capable of trying to understand what messages does the people in the world around me want to send me, and whether it's in my favor or not. Again, here,
Heba,
yes.
We have another question.
Sure.
I'm going to ask Beviano, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question. Beviano, I don't know. She was asking about the sculptures were representations of non-Egyptian leaders who wanted to look nice for the Egyptians to like them. I'm not sure. Oh, okay, sorry. Apparently, Heba, she's having some Wi-Fi issues.
No problem. No,
So I was trying to make her ask the question herself, so we could maybe understand it better. But no, yeah, it doesn't seem she can talk to us. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. Okay, yes, I understand the question. It's yes and no. It's yes, they wanted to look nice for the Egyptians to like them, but it's also not just nice, but they wanted to look Egyptian as well. They wanted to make the Egyptians feel that they are equally Egyptians. They are not foreign rulers. And that is key in how you want to, on how you want to be able to rule a local culture, being local. That is why I was telling you that what I liked about Jamaica, or it's the key of being local. The more local you are, the more you fit in, and the more you are successful in sending any messages you want to send, or successful in reaching whatever motives that you have. So they were, yes, they wanted to send a message that they were equally, yes, nice and peaceful by this smile, optimistic, that we're not going to rule by force, we're going to rule by heart, but equally by mind. Yeah, it's usually, it's a case of how you can win the hearts and minds by a statue. So for example, the one we had before was how you can win the hearts and mind of your Egyptian audiences or of your Egyptian people. But this, for example, was intended of how to win the hearts and mind of your Greek citizens as well, because there was a huge Greek presence in Egypt even before Alexander the Great came to Egypt in 332 BC. There was a huge Greek presence because there were a lot of merchants, there was a lot of commercial exchange between the Egyptians and the Greeks, and the Greeks were very interested in the Egyptian religion. So we have graffiti of a lot of Greek tourists who came to Egypt to visit the temples, and they left their graffiti. Don't do graffiti today. Graffiti today is banned, but at the time, graffiti was a way of it was the only way to document a visit. Today you can document it by just tagging the museum in a post, etc., or tagging the temple. So you don't need to graffiti it. We have our own ways of making modern graffitis, but then that was it was an acceptable means of documenting that I've been there, I've visited. And from the graffiti we find in Egyptian temples, there were a lot of Greek visitors who some were tourists and some were residents who came to Egypt around that time. And they equally needed representation, and they equally needed to feel that they fit in and that they are perceived as an integral part of the society. So as the king would make an image for him as an Egyptian pharaoh, he would equally make an image for him as a Greek basileus. Like the word for ruler was basileus in Greek. So he would represent himself in purely Greek manner. Again, as I'm saying, the statue here would look white, but it could have been painted back in the time, and Ptolemy I could have been dark-skinned, not white-skinned. It's just that the method of painting or pigmentation that was adopted in Greek sculpture is very different than the Egyptian one. And while we can have equally the material that was adopted, usually Greek sculptors preferred marble. And when it comes to marble, it's very easy for the paint or the color to disappear after time. Like its preservation would be difficult. But usually in Egyptian tradition, we would tend to have limestone. And limestone is a far harder stone, unlike marble. And it's the probability of colors to remain on stone is higher than marble. So again, when you see another white Greek statue, you have to reflect, or you have to realize that it doesn't mean that it was white at the time, and it doesn't equally mean that the person who owns this sculpture or that this sculpture represents was equally white. He could have been of a darker skin, but it's just the state of being or the state of preservation of marble and this type of sculpture that led to us having them looking in pure white format. I'll move a bit from this, but yes. Now, this is a reconstruction of Alexandria, how Alexandria might have looked like. And we would see here the pharaohs, which would be one of the things that you can see from a distance, and it helps all the ships and all those who are navigating around the Mediterranean or navigating around or nearby Alexandria to find their way easily, like providing them with some light, but equally for those who are in Alexandria to be able to see if there are any naval troops who might be coming to attack them one way or the other. So this is how Alexandria looked like. And Alexandria is one of the earliest cities in the world that had a construction or like street design that is very similar to what we have today. In earlier Egyptian cities, there was no this very engineered quarters or this division of quarters and streets. It's not quarters in the sense of segregation like ghettos, but it's just an architectural arrangement, more or less a more architecturally defined type of city civil organization. This is the first city in the world that has this very strict architectural civil organization. It wasn't meant to segregate the various communities, but it was meant to offer some sort of order, and it was the contribution that the Egyptians and the Greeks at the time offered to the world in terms of technology. We all know, or you might want to know, that there was the Library of Alexandria, and this was it was a major scientific center, not only in the Mediterranean world, but in the whole world. And equally, the Pharos and the way it was constructed in a very technological mean that was again a contribution offered to the world. What is interesting here is that this would be a statue of the Greek ruler placed inside a place just by the Pharos here. So when you reflect, this is a purely Egyptian style statuary. By the way, this was retrieved from under the sea. So this is why we could see that part of it got, due to the salt, and obviously the fish were having fun again around it, it lost a bit of its features, or it looks a bit more damaged, and this is the damage of the salty water. That's why it would look different in terms of the facial features from the earlier sculptures we had, but this was because it was found under the sea, and because of the damage caused to it by the sea water, which has affected its state of preservation. But this would be, if you were coming to visit Egypt from the Mediterranean, from the Western world, this would be the first thing that you would see, not only of Egypt, but of its pharaoh, of its ruler, that he was a purely Egyptian pharaoh. And this again defies all the narrative that we have about Alexandria, be it from Liz Taylor and the movie of Cleopatra, etc., of how extremely Greek Alexandria was. No, it wasn't. It was a mix between Egyptian and Greek sculpture and traditions. So this is again the evidence, and it was only retrieved recently in 2004 or 5, and it currently stands just outside the modern Library of Alexandria, which modern Egypt has erected recently, in a way of trying to offer a tribute to the earlier Alexandrian civilization, which gave us the Alexandria that we know today. So again, this is another political message being sent. This is another way of targeting the outside audiences. This is a reconstruction of all the colossal statuary that was discovered under the sea, just nearby Alexandria. And here we have this little guy, human being here, for you to see, to match the height, like as a way of trying to mark or trying to assess the length or the height of the statuary. So they were extremely colossal, like more than life size, like beyond life size statuary, except for 2. And they were they were depicting the kings and the queens of Egypt, as well as the deities, other gods, like the god of the Nile, Hapi, god Osiris, goddess Isis, etc. Again, these were all erected just outside the palace of the king, and this is again the palace in Alexandria, that was the capital at the time. And this is again a reconstruction of the door to see just the height of the door. These were all discovered from under the water in 2004, 2005, and they are currently in touring exhibitions, and they should be returning to Egypt by the end of this year. So hopefully, if you have an opportunity to visit Egypt in the future and the Grand Egyptian Museum, you would just be able to see them for real, and perhaps remember our lecture and the lovely invitation that I got from Alexis to share with you here today. This is again another map reconstruction of how the palace and the statues that were discovered looked like. I'm sharing this with you because I want you to reflect on how there is this perception or the representation of the Greek palace, as I was just as Anthony Hopkins and as the image that I shared with you and as in the movie of Cleopatra, but it has nothing to do with reality. This was extremely a very both Egyptian and Greek city. There was so much cultural mix, and one couldn't perceive this as only Greek, as the movies want to sell it out to us, or even as how it gets displayed in the British Museum today. The everything that is retrieved from Alexandria, all the artifacts that come from Alexandria, are placed solely in the Greek and Roman department. They don't even get displayed with the other ancient Egyptian sculptures or galleries. And this is something that we would need to reflect on, how this is extremely wrong and goes against what happened in the past. This is how, after it got retrieved from under the water, and one could say the parade or the procession that the statues had in modern Alexandria. And I chose it because it's a very interesting story, image here. You would see the Greek Egyptian pharaoh at the time coming out of the water, the archaeologists, and someone who's just a local Egyptian who's just in a card. So you would see images of Egypt as extremely modern, extremely ancient, a little bit of poverty too, but diverse in a mosque. So it encapsulates Egypt's past and present today, that it's very difficult to tick box it or to just frame it in the very narrow typology that Western museum display tends to offer us. It's extremely diverse, and even a photograph like this gives us an impression of how Egypt's past and present is very vibrant and very diverse and very different than the very imagined, frozen in type and place displays we tend to see in museums. I don't know, Alexis, you were mentioning. This brings the end of my prepared presentation, and I don't know, you were saying about sharing some of the ancient Egyptian collections that you would have.
Yes, I would love to, but I wanted to just I don't know if certain students on how much you guys really, watch the news and, or read. But remember, if you don't, you really should. But I saw on BBC that last photo of the objects being taken out of the water. Even though this is a little more extreme, but it just reminded me that on BBC I saw where the Egyptian government had that grand procession.
Yes, the gold.
The pharaohs.
The mummies, yeah.
The mummies. No, students, you need to see this procession.
Yeah.
My mind was blown.
It's available on YouTube for free.
On YouTube. For free,
yeah.
And you can see it's like about.
I'll put you a link here. I'll put a link on the chat.
Yeah, it's like a 2-hour long thing.
Yes, yeah.
It's guys, I can't describe it. You just have to experience it for yourselves. But it really showed, like what you just said, Heba, about the past and the present, like the old and the new coming together for this procession. So just check it out. I won't say anymore. It's something to behold. But I'm putting on my gloves. Basic conservation 101, guys. When handling artifacts. Now, as Heba said, Heba has seen some of these artifacts already. I don't know if any of our students have. Wait, what does Beviana say? Excuse me, miss, are mummies real? As in people really wrapped in tissue? Yes, miss, I need to see it. Heba, would you like to tell Beviana that mummies are real?
I muted myself because I was getting the YouTubes, and you would have listened and you would have heard it got on already. So I'll put now, there is the link for the Golden Parade. Perhaps when you have a time, it's 2 hours something. So this is it. This is the link. You can all watch it for free. But yes, these are like the mummies. They were human beings who were mummified by the priests, again, who were the holders of all knowledge and all power, with specific mummification techniques that were adopted by the ancient Egyptians. The intention was to preserve the body for it to be resurrected or for rebirth. The ancient Egyptians believed that the only way for you to reach the afterlife is that you have all your body intact, preserved. So they would take the internal organs and they would place the internal organs in jars. Each organ goes in a specific jar, and we call them the 4 canopic jars. And then they would only leave inside the mummy the heart, because they believed that whether you would go to heaven or hell depends on how good-hearted you were, not only your deeds, but the way, your kindness and the way. And I think this is extremely moving way of assessing people. It's just it all goes back to the heart. And I think in Jamaica you're very like that as well, like us. It's very emotional. That's how you assess someone as being a good or bad person, by how kind-hearted they are or not. So they would leave the heart for the assessment, and then after the body gets mummified, it gets wrapped in linen, and inside the linen they would put small amulets to make sure that all the evil spirits would stay away from the body, and that the body is extremely protected. So yes, they are real human beings, and yes, they are mummified, but we need to think that only those who were rich and mighty, they could afford getting mummified. Not everyone had the opportunity to get mummified. So I don't know if, I don't think I could have afforded if but my current I'm not sure if I were so luckily I'm not in ancient Egypt anymore, because I wouldn't have afforded having a top-notch mummification procedure, unless if I worked within the temple or with the priests, I would have managed to get something that is a bit low-key or a bit on the cheaper side of mummification. But yeah, and there were workshops for mummification, and you would pay for it, and the more rich you are, the better the mummification, your mummified body would be. So yeah.
Yes, we don't have any mummies from
Good.
Egypt in our collection. Just putting that out there, but we do have a part of the mummification process that Heba just mentioned. So this is an example of a canopic
jar. Yes. Yes, with the stop. Yes, with the stopper. Yes. So that would be the lid that you would put on the canopic jar itself.
Yeah, I don't know if the base survived, but this is what we have
the pot
in our
itself.
Yeah. So this is what it looks like. Let's get closer.
Not necessarily, because there were at times some would have. I can read the question and I'm responding to the question straight. That doesn't necessarily would have held the brain given the stopper, because there were 4. You can either have a falcon or a jackal or a human head or something else. So there were various types of heads, and it depends on which deity was represented in the jar. You would have which specific part of the 4 organs put inside. So not necessarily, no, it doesn't have to necessarily have been the brain in this case.
Now, I'm not sure if we're pronouncing this correctly, Heba.
Okay.
We have it as a shawabti.
Shawabti, yes, shapti, yes, shapti, yes, shawabti or shapti, yes, both are right.
No, because how we were pronouncing it, it could have been perceived as a curse word in Jamaican language. So thank you.
Shawabti or shapti.
Shawabti, thank you. So,
that's a blue faience. By the way, blue faience, this material it's peculiar to Egypt. You didn't find it elsewhere, and that's of a woman. These shapti or shawabtis, these were the servants that you would have with you for the afterlife. So but that again, it depends on how wealthy you were. So if you were a very wealthy person, you would have one for each day. So you would have 365 small statuettes like this one, and each of them would perform a task in the afterworld or in the afterlife on your behalf. So one would go farm the land for you, one would go bring you food, one would go bring you wood, etc. So these were the servants that one would have had in the afterlife, performing all the tasks instead of the deceased. That's why only if you're rich you can have those servants accompanying you even in the afterlife, not just in the actual life, daily life.
Then we have here a carving of Horus.
Horus, yes.
Horus.
Horus is the main king. Yes, this would have been coming from a lead for a Shapti box. So there would be a box that would have one of those Shaptis inside, and that would be the lid covering the Shapti box. The falcon god, Horus, he's the son of Osiris, and Isis and Osiris were the main deities, the main gods, and Horus, we call him the avenger of the king because he's the one who took revenge for his father from his bad brother Set, who cut Osiris' body into 4 pieces and have spreaded them all over Egypt. And Isis, the loving wife, the loving female, by her magic and by her hard work, she managed to recollect the corpses once again, and she brought up her son Horus in a way that he's so brave and mighty that he's always the one taking revenge for his father Osiris or for the king and being the protector. And the king is perceived as Horus on earth. So there would be Horus, the falcon, the bird in the sky, and the king is Horus on earth. That's how the king is a god.
And then we have the scribe Neb-Retute.
Yes.
Again, apologies.
This is very interesting because this is a caste. Yes, no, that's fine. This is very interesting because this is a caste. This is not a proper ancient Egyptian artifact. It's a caste. So we have the real one exists 2 kilometers away from me in the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir, is stored there and in display. So this is how Cairo and Jamaica are linked. So we have the actual object in the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir in Cairo, but during the time of colonialism, and when they were exporting a lot of objects from Egypt, so one way was to export the actual objects or to export casts of an existing artifact. So this is one of the casts, and it comes from an area called Tal al-Amarna, and this dates back to the time of Akhenaten, who was beyond, who was for Egypt becoming more of monolithic rather than just monolithic when it comes to religion, having one major god. He didn't cancel all the other gods, but he believed in having one major god on the pantheon, and which was called Atun, which was the sun. This is so interesting.
The description we have is that it says a high official is portrayed in the attitude of a scribe.
Yes, that's very true.
Under the attentive gaze of the god Thoth.
God Thoth.
Patron of writing.
Yes, patron of writing. God of writing and wisdom. That's the baboon. Yeah.
Wisdom.
Baboon. The baboon, yes. He gets represented as the baboon. Thoth, yes. We can tell that he's a high official, this guy, from 2 things. This is what I was talking about, the messages in sculpture. From the garment, what he's wearing, because this male dress is something that only the elite could afford to wear. Equally, his wig, the way he styles his hair, this is how the elite or those who had major power would have styled their wig. So again, it's these messages again and again that you can unpack or deconstruct from a statue that can tell you a lot about the owner and the ancient time from these very small messages that we can read. So you can equally read the statue.
And the last one we have to show you guys is a alabaster pot. It's very tiny.
Yeah.
This is not a part of the pot. It's like on a piece of wax. I can.
Yes.
Guys, I'm trying to be as delicate with these little.
Yeah, I know. This is so interesting.
Pigment.
Yes, because all of these pots were used for like makeup and for eye makeup, and eye makeup was for males and females alike. And you would see very tiny applicators would come with them, similar to the ones we have, the modern makeup applicators, but they would have been made out of iron. And you would use it, you would dip the applicator in this small pot and get either pigments, as in to color your eye, or oils, for infection or whatever. So they were used mainly for makeup, oils, perfumes as well. There were different uses of these tiny pots. You would usually have these pots with you, like buried with you in your tomb. So it's something that you would use in your daily life. But as archaeologists, we tend to discover them or retrieve them from a funerary setting, from the tomb, because the ancient Egyptian would take everything that he has used during his life with him in the tomb to make sure that he replicates life in the afterlife. So something I want you to reflect upon is that the Egyptians, unlike the conception that the West want to send us, or the Western way of discussing things, that it's usually death and mummies, the Egyptians were pro-life, and they were doing everything to ensure that they can live again. So for them to die is to be resurrected, is to live again. So death is not the end, is not this dark, this dark tunnel that you would reach and that's it, the life has ended. No, it's another opportunity for you to live another type of life. And in the Egyptian conception, it was even a far better life than any would have had in their proper life. So if you're poor, you would get the opportunity to get more rich and have more resources in the afterlife, in heaven, etc., etc. So it was a very optimistic way of looking at things, not the very dark, gloomy perception of death that modern Western culture tend to have. So because I usually hated when they usually have like all the galleries of ancient Egypt, they tend to call them death in ancient Egypt. Yeah, there was death, but it wasn't death in this very dark connotation or perception. It was to die. You're dying to live again. You're not dying. It's not the end of life. It's the beginning of a new one.
Yes. Well, Heba, thank you for that. I believe that we may need to have a second lecture where we show all of our artifacts and you just tell the stories.
I would love to do that.
So students, look out for that, because one of the things, well, our students may not know, is that when we were a colony, a lot of things were left here, given to the museum, and a lot of information was not added. So we had to try our best here to do our own research. And honestly, sometimes we get it wrong, as well as the pronunciations,
of course, yeah.
All of that. As I said, I had to keep apologizing for butchering the words. So again, I know that my keeper of the collections here, she's probably watching now, taking notes, because the descriptions we have are very, very limited, or based on what we found in articles or on Google. But all of the artifacts that you just saw, it says here, we received them from the estate of Sir Robert Mond, who was an industrial chemist and archaeologist who financed and worked at archaeological excavations in Egypt. And he was one of the colleagues of Sir Howard Carter, who co-discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun.
Yes, he was a British Egyptology enthusiast. And I can help you in sharing with you some of the archival material. For example, the cast we saw for the High Official and the Baboon. I know the archive record of it in the Egypt Exploration Society, and I can show you the drawing that they made of it upon its discovery and how it's a cast. And I can always bring you a photograph of the real one here in the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir, in Cairo.
We would really need to
appreciate so we can bring them together, reunite them.
Because one of the things to that we have realized is that, again, because of the non-existence of some records, we don't know what is potentially like replicas and originals.
Of course.
So, you know, we could just look on this and say, oh, this is original.
No, it's a replica.
But it's not.
It's a cast.
A replica. I'm just using this as an example. There are other artifacts we have here that unfortunately, as I said, were, just not, the records were kind of non-existent. So thank you for that, Heba. Now I'm gonna
thank you.
Thank you so much. Students, you have any questions or comments? Oh, I said Beviana said, yes, eye makeup was done a lot based on what I have seen in movies.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah. I tried once to do the same Cleopatra
Eyeliner?
Liz Taylor eyeliner. Oh, it was a disaster. It was bad. I tried though. I tried.
Even I can't do it, Alexis. Like, don't feel so bad about this. It's very difficult. It needs a lot of training to master this technique.
Yeah. So if there are no other questions, anybody on YouTube, I'm not seeing anything. All right, we'll just then, I guess, close off the lecture. Heba, thank you
so much.
Thank you.
No, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I hope our students learned something today. And maybe another time to, and I know you said we kind of changed the topic from what we discussed, but I know that because one of the things that was on the CSEC syllabus was on the Nile,
exactly,
the River Nile. And I noticed that one of the very first slides that you had, it showed all of the cities. And I noticed, I don't know if our students noticed, how they were majority were all along the river, going down.
That's the core of Egypt. That's the core of Egypt.
And I encourage students that, again, if you can, and when the pandemic is very, very, very gone from the world, we hope soon, if you go to the British Museum, you can see all of the pictures that Heba shared with you for yourself. I had that privilege of going to the British Museum in 2019, and Heba now explaining to me what I saw makes a lot of sense. I never picked up on it. I did kind of feel, why are all of these Egyptian artifacts everywhere? They're like just scattered. Well, it felt to me scattered. And then I also wondered, is it because the British Museum stole so many artifacts that they didn't know where to put them?
Yeah.
They were just like, ooh, we put that over there and spread the wealth that they
that's what they did.
Stole from Egypt.
Yeah.
And I was even thinking about how when you enter the British Museum, again, you can see this online, but I'm just talking about my own personal experience. When I entered, and the Rosetta Stone was just there.
Yes,
No
in the middle of everything. No context, nothing.
Of like a area.
It's
just
like
there.
an Empire trophy display. It's a trophy display.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how the British Museum, as just an example of one museum, went about displaying these artifacts. So again, you guys, I know that a lot of museums have put things up on YouTube. They've done it virtually. So we encourage you to check that out for yourselves.
Yes.
And again, guys, thank you, Heba. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. And thank you for having me and for the kind invitation.
In Egypt, but I know it's in nighttime in Egypt now, so we appreciate it.
No, that's fine.
Yes. Oh yes, Beviana says thank you, and she learned a lot. I'm so glad, Beviana.
I learned a lot to do. Thank you all
right,
so much.
guys. Well, be safe, everyone.
You too.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, guys. And remember, all of our students on still tune in tomorrow for our next CSEC lecture. All right, Heba, thank you.
Yes.
Bye,
thank you.
Guys.
Take care. Have a lovely day. Not evening.
Heba.
Evening for me, a lovely day for you. Take care. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
It's lunchtime now for us.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's dinner time here. So, yeah.
Bye, guys. Bye,
Bye.
Heba.
Take care. Bye.
Dinner
Bye.
time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.